thank you for coming, because I was wondering if anybody would show up to another talk, since they gave one about a year ago. And I thought, okay, will they show up to a second one? So thank you for coming. My name is Mike Koehler. I do own, with my brothers, Dancehall, and I am so happy that we got it to this stage where we can do these kind of things, because this is really what Dancehall is about. It's about getting here after a work day, getting the community together, and celebrating both history, music, and talking to each other about what this town's about. So I am really so happy we have these kind of things. So thank you. So I will give a little bit of a brief background. I was asked earlier, why I had started along the lines of Eddie Hanson and what my interest was in Eddie Hanson. I'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. But he really kind of popped up as I was doing the work on the Danes Hall and looking up the history of the hall and trying to understand. And I was going through newspaper articles and everything, and up popped the name Eddie Hanson in one newspaper article. And the name rang a bell to me, and I did know of Eddie Hanson because I recalled going as a teenager. My grandmother, who was a Wisconsin, Waupaca born and raised person, we would come up here in the summers and spend time with our grandmother, and she took me down to Simpson's restaurant one Saturday to listen to Eddie Hanson. Now, I was a teenager in the 70s, and she drags me to Simpson's restaurant, which is a great restaurant, by the way, and we really need to keep that restaurant, by the way. I went there and listened to his music, and I have to be honest with you, I had no interest in Eddie Hanson's music. It was something from a different era. I mean, this is Elvis Presley era, this is, Diana Ross era, this was Saturday Night Fever, and I'm listening to a guy on an organ and a piano and a restaurant on Main Street in Dayton. But I will tell you, if you watched him play, he fascinated you. Now, I will say that I wasn't interested in necessarily organ music at the time, because I was an accordion player as a kid. That was my instrument. But watching him on that keyboard was just fascinating. I think he had hands that stretched 13 keys, just had very large hands, but it was fascinating to watch. How many of you actually saw him perform? Everybody in the room. So I was going to say, when a historical society meeting or presentation starts and you're part of it, you really feel old. But that's the way this one starts, is that we actually did meet Eddie Hanson, and I'll get into a little bit about the story of Eddie Hanson and some other connections we had with him. But I'd like to talk, I became fascinated by the guy when I started doing the background research, and the more and more you looked into his work, the more and more you said, wow, this guy was a very accomplished person from Waupaca. I mean, he really made the big time. And when I started to pick up his music and look at it and read it, because I started to buy his music up from every place I could find it, including bookstore down the street, had some. And you may have some in your piano bench, some Eddie Hanson music. If you have any, please take it to the Historical Society, because we're trying to make copies of what we can find. This is 100-year-old music, sheet music, and it's really hard to find. But we have several up here if you want to look at the ones we have collected. He left much of his collection to universities, and he left some of it's down at the Mills Library in Madison, the University of Madison. So if you have any, please bring it to Tracy over at the Historical Society so we can copy it and keep it in the archives. We already had the introductions. Linda Harmon is joining us today. Thank you, Linda. She is... When I came up with a ragtime music, everybody said you need to talk to Linda Harmon, and so Marcy found her and contacted her and got her involved in this. So I'm so happy she's here. She's going to play a few of Eddie's pieces for us tonight. Marcy, of course, is going to join us up here at the end. Thank you, Marcy. I want to thank Tracy, not only for inviting me to do this, but Tracy was really involved in the process. She found music for me. She was doing some research. She had some stories that she found out, and so thank you for that. And of course, the Koehler family, who are scattered in the room there, Jack, Joe, that's fine. And someplace in the room, I think, is my sister Mary. Is she here? Well, if you see her, it's her birthday today, so that's actually... I told you you're all here for her birthday, so thank you. So meeting Eddie Hanson. If you see that picture up there, that's what I know of Eddie Hanson. He was a very old man playing down at Simpson's. And he always had that beret on. That's what I remember him. And you'd see him around town with that beret. He lived on Main Street. He played at Simpson's restaurant, and that's where I met him. I told the story already. That's the era of Diana Ross and Elvis and Saturday Night Fever, and Eddie Hanson just wasn't of that genre. He just wasn't. But to see him play fascinated you. And then you realize that much of what he was playing, he wrote. Fascinated you even more. So as I go through the presentation today, I'm going to tell some stories that I found about him and that I learned about him and what he was about, and how he led really he is himself the history of music of the 20th century, because he really went through all the genres of music during his lifetime and adapted very well to it. He was actually not born in Waupaca. He was born, which I think some newspaper articles said he was born in Waupaca. He was actually born in New London. But he was born in New London in 1893, maybe, because there's other things that point to the fact he was born 5 years later in 1898. So we really don't know. And actually, one of the articles said, "Why do you lie about your age?" And he argues with the reporter, "I'm not lying about my age. I never lied about my age." So obviously, there's some other people who question his birthday, but it doesn't really make a difference. By the 1900 census, the census in 1900, he was a resident of Waupaca. So he was either 7 years or 2 years old when his family was living in Waupaca by that time. So he was an infant or a young boy at the time. He did eventually have a farm. He lived with his family out on Highway E. And so that picture there, I don't know if you get in your car and drive down the road there, about 2-3 miles out of town, you're going to see that farm there. That was the Hanson farm. So this is kind of where he grew up. Okay. Now the reason that's interesting to me is because, I don't know, is Diane Sorensen in the room? If you know Diane Sorensen, that's her farm. So she now lives in Hanson's home. If you ask anybody, do they know where the Hanson farm is? That's about 75% of the city's farms are Hanson farms, because everybody's either Hanson or Peterson in this town, I think. But that's his farm, and that's the Hanson farm. And literally across the road here, this side over here, is the Sorensen farm, and that's our family. So my grandmother was Sarah Sorensen. She grew up across the way. And I never knew why she dragged me to hear Eddie Hanson, but she dragged me to hear Eddie Hanson because she knew him as a kid. And so I always, I do remember that Eddie Hanson came up to the table and would say, "Hello, Sarah," as if he knew her. But that didn't surprise me because everybody in Waupaca either knows you or you're related to them. It's just that kind of a town. So it didn't surprise me that she knew him, that he knew her. But I now learned that they lived across the streets from each other, across the road from each other. And my grandmother's childhood friend that she went to school with in grade school was a woman up there called Peggy Hanson Dopp, who you may know wrote the book Tomorrow is a River. And Peggy Hanson Dopp was Eddie Hanson's sister. And if you actually get in your car and drive south of town and go south of town towards Wild Rose, you're going to see the Dopp Dairy Domain, and that was where Peggy Hanson was. And I do remember going there to get that book signed with my grandmother by her friend Peggy Hanson. So there's the connection and why, our family became interested in him. Why my grandmother dragged me to listen to him. But let's go back to the story of Eddie Hanson. I said he was born in August 1st, 1893. Maybe it was 5 years later. In New London, to Henrietta and August Hanson. His mother played the piano, and she was a native of Wisconsin. His father was an immigrant from Denmark, and they came from Denmark, and he played the trumpet and violin. And some of the newspaper articles in what it was called the Waupaca Republican, or the Republican, the old newspapers, will mention that August Hanson was playing at the local venues around town. So he played, and he also played in the city band. So the city band, going back to that era, had the Hansons playing. As I said, the 1900 census has him listed in Farmington, which of course is not there. He's over in Farmington side of thing. But it may be that his father listed Farmington in the census because his father worked at the Veterans Home. So his father was working at the Veterans Home. He learned to play the piano at an early age, and he loved music at a very early age. So at 8 years old, his father enrolled him in piano lessons. And from what you read, he really just didn't play the piano. He became obsessed with the piano at a very, very young age. He did go to Waupaca High School for his first couple years, and then the family eventually moved over to Neenah for a while before returning back to Waupaca. So there's the Neenah connection, and Neenah considers him a hometown boy also. And they have a lot of his information on Eddie Hanson. And in fact, they're so fascinated by him over in Neenah that they actually wrote a play about him. That sometime the city should perform the play, get the script for that play and play it. But they did a play about him because the story of his life was so fascinating. He played saxophone in the high school band. During his high school years, his family, as I said, moved to Neenah, where Eddie got his first song published in 1911. And he says himself, he published his first music when he was 13. In 1911 was the first publication, which means he actually was born in 1898. So if that's true, then he himself knows he was born in 1898. And it was when evening shades are falling. In 1912, he got his second song published, which is the one you see there called Homecoming. He wrote that with the words were written by Jane Strang, who was trying to write a song for the 4th of July celebration that year. I actually do have, the only one that I can find is an original copy of that song here. So we do have an original copy of that. I eventually would like these to go into the library down in Madison, but we'll make copies for the town here so we can keep them here. But there's an original copy of it. So the story goes with that song here. He actually, Jane Strange wanted to have the celebration in Menasha for this 4th of July. So she was planning this big party and this big celebration, and she wanted a piece of music written specifically for that event. And so she actually wrote the words, but she didn't write music. So she needed to find somebody to write the music, and she couldn't find anybody, so she put an ad in the newspaper. And she put the ad in the newspaper, and only one person replied, and it was Ethwell. His name was Ethwell. I don't know who would name their child Ethwell, but his name was Ethwell Hanson. And he replied, he says, I can write the music for you. And so she then came over here. She says she came to Waupaca, so he must have been in Waupaca, to see if she could talk him into writing the song. And when she got to his house, realizing he's only a 14-year-old kid, was kind of surprised as to what. And he says, no, I can do this. And he played for her, and she said, he's the guy. So a 14-year-old kid. That shows you kind of the genius of Eddie Hanson at the time. So he did write that song. It was actually published. So Jane Strain and him got that published. The earliest song he wrote even before that one was one he says he wrote when he was in grade school. And it was called Golden Glow. And we actually have an original copy of that up here too. So here's an original copy of that. I like to show these because the artwork on the cover of these is just fascinating. It's just beautiful, beautiful artwork. So we are, by the way, for those who are we're trying to make copies of all these, as original as we can get them, so we have them copies, because I have to tell you, those 100-and-some-year-old pieces of music are very kind of getting brittle. So we're trying to preserve these. But he wrote Golden Glow. He said he wrote it for his mother. And he named it after the flowers in her garden, the golden glow flowers she had in her garden. And that was written and published in 1913. He did say once in another article I had about Eddie Hanson in the newspaper, and when he was interviewed by the newspaper, he says, of all the pieces of music I don't have my first song. He couldn't find a single copy of that sheet music wherever he looked. He said, I have everything else but that one song. Well, we do have it now, so we did find one. Being his first song, I thought we'd start out with that, so let's take a listen to his very first song by Linda Harmon. Beautiful piece. And it's just amazing that a kid in grade school wrote that. Chelsea, the genius. But beautifully played by Linda, so thank you for doing that. Also, I want to point out the beautiful Steinway that she's playing on from 1896. So it's part of the Dancehall atmosphere. So if you're a musician and want to play it, it's here for you. Another person who inspired her, I also want to talk about who inspired him and who got him into the big time, because he really was the big time, and how he got into the big time. Does anybody here ever hear of Dan Barton? One person back there. You must play the organ. So Dan Barton built organs. He built theater organs. Dan Barton actually comes from Amherst. That's where he grew up, in Amherst. But he eventually built a company over in Oshkosh called the Bartola Musical Instrument Company in Oshkosh. And Dan started to play around with creating a new organ, because the typical organs were your church organs of the day. So a church organ had a lot of pipes, but that's about it. And he thought, well, he had this idea that movies were coming out, and there was the silent movie era, and he wanted to add more than just the sounds of pianos in the background or sounds of a typical organ in the background. He wanted to add more to the movie, so he decided he's going to add percussion to the thing. He's going to add bells to the things. He's going to add chimes to his organ. So he started adding all these different things to his organ. And he was working with pianists, very accomplished pianists, and they were trying to get them to play. Well, as Dan Barton tells the story, Dan Barton says, I was developing this organ, and one day in walks this kid, and this kid says he wanted to play my organ. I said, go ahead, go at it. And Dan Barton says, when Eddie Hanson got to that keyboard, he said he brought out more music than any of the pianists he had ever worked with before, and he was a kid. So he continued to develop these organs. And because he was so fascinated by Eddie, that whenever he tried to sell an organ, he pretty much sold Eddie with it. And said, look, this is what it can do. But really, he said Eddie was the first one to actually master that piece of instrument. I want to show you what a Barton organ looks like, if you don't have an idea what it looks like. These are Barton organs. They literally sometimes... So this is Eddie Hanson at a Barton organ down in Chicago. That one was at the Oriental Theater. The one up there was at the Chicago Stadium. If anybody remembers the Chicago Stadium, which has been replaced in Chicago by the United Center. But back in the day, that's where the Blackhawks and the Bulls and all the sports teams used to play in the stadium. And that was the organ at the stadium. It literally has 6 keyboards on it, including the pedals. And I can't tell you how many hundreds of stops it has surrounding them. And it took up pretty much a whole platform with the pipes and the cymbals and the chimes and the bells and the horns and everything. It was just a fascinating instrument. But that's what was developed by a guy from Amherst. So this is really a pretty impressive musical center here in central Wisconsin. And really, if you look at that instrument, it's not the kind of instrument you just walk up to and say, I played the organ. You really had to master the whole set of what it could do. And as Dan Barton says, Eddie knew it. He mastered it first. And so he went and kind of put these things together. And one of the first places he put it was actually in a theater in Neenah called the Doty Theater. So the Doty Theater was in Neenah, and he put one of his first organs into the Doty Theater, but he didn't have anybody who could play it, so Eddie was his guy. So he basically brought Eddie to Neenah. The question is, did Eddie go to Neenah with his family, or did he bring him there first and then his family followed? I don't know that. But Eddie was playing at the Doty Theater as backup to the silent movies. It was really back up to the silent movie era. And he met a person, while he was playing one day, as Eddie told the story to the reporters once, he said, as I was in the theater, the theater owner, manager came to me and says, there's a very important person here today, so play well. He said, who's there? And he said, Carrie Jacobs Bonds. Has anybody heard of Carrie Jacobs Bonds? Well, one of her songs you do know, I think, is I Love You Truly. So if you've heard of I Love You Truly, that was one of her songs. Carrie Jacobs Bonds is another Wisconsin gal from Janesville. She was raised in Janesville, eventually ended up out in Hollywood, writing music out in Hollywood era. And she was probably one of the most prolific writers of music of the era. And Eddie Hanson knew her music very well. He said, in fact, Eddie says, I had every single piece of her music. I knew them by heart. He was so fascinated by her. And for her to be in the theater that day was just a big thing for him. So he said, I put all the music to the side, and I just played from memory every song that she wrote. And she was very fascinated by the fact that he did this. And so she came and talked to him a bit and got him, encouraged him a little bit, and said, she was very impressed with what he did. Carrie Barnes Jacobs, by the way, Jacobs Bonds, I should say, said that when she was writing her music, and she started writing music, she said she would try to get it published, but she couldn't get it published. Nobody would publish her. The reason nobody would publish her is because she was a woman, and women just don't do that. You don't write music and you don't publish. So she was very discouraged by that. She tried to get men to publish it for her. So she'd give it to men who would see if they would publish it on her behalf, but they wanted their name on it. And she said, no deal. Eventually, she got so frustrated, she opened up her own publishing company and ended up being a multimillionaire. The first woman to make millions of dollars in the music industry was Carrie Jacobs Bonds with her music. Very famous at the time. So she kind of inspired him quite a bit in his days as a teenager. This was also an era of ragtime. And so this is the early 20th century. And ragtime was it. His family had moved back to about 1500. It says that his family moved back to the Waupaca area. His father was at the King's. He played at various events, but in the Waupaca area, including some of the local movie houses here, that will say that he played at some of the local movie houses in Waupaca. But in 1917, he published another song called Rattlesnake Rag, which he said he wrote he couldn't remember either in his 8th grade or first year of high school. He wrote this one too. And he got that one published in 1917. Now, if you put that in time frame that he's born, he's only about 18 or 19 years old at that time, so a teenager again. Again, I point out here that this is a silent movie era, and ragtime was it. That was the backup to the silent movies. And ragtime just is a fascinating style of music in itself. It was the predecessor to jazz. There was the piano version, so it was always played on the piano to jazz. And so we have Rattlesnake Rag here, which is actually I think one of his best songs from a teenager. It's one of his best songs. So Linda, why don't you play Rattlesnake Rag for us? Is that a great piece or what? I mean, it's just it's fascinating. I want to point out, Linda, stand up for a second, because she's wearing one of the medals she won for her ragtime performances. I think it's just a tremendous piece of music, and again, I just am fascinated that a teenager from Waupaca could write such quality pieces like that at that age. But then the Warriors. So he does have a draft card that he was issued. I think it said 1917 or 1918 he was issued a draft card. So again, it points to actually, if it's 1917 and he's being drafted into the Army or Navy, he enlisted actually in the Navy, but he has a draft card. He's really more 1898 time frame. But he enlisted in the Navy, and he actually got a really nice assignment. He was assigned to John Philip Sousa's band. And he got to tour the country selling bonds, war bonds at the time, with John Philip Sousa. And as at that period of time, and we're not going to play any of these pieces from them, but during that period of time, he comes up with the patriotic songs, the marches and stuff like that. And so one of them that I was able to find, The Spirit of the USA, is of that style. It's a march from that era. He also attended Lawrence University in Appleton. So anybody from Lawrence? Nell Buchman from Waupaca. Does anybody know Nell? Oh, you got to get to know Nell. You got to get to know Nell. Nell is actually a professor over there of piano at Lawrence University. She lives in Waupaca and teaches over there. She's actually helped me in the purchase of the Steinway. She helped find one. Well, we found one, and then she went and played it to make sure it was a quality instrument, and it was. But Nell lives in town here. Her husband is a professor of jazz piano over at Stevens Point, and that's why they live in Waupaca, because one goes east and one goes west in the morning. But that's Lawrence University, and that's where he studied music. 1920, he entered a contest. So he decided he's going to enter a contest. And there was a contest by a music publishing company down in Chicago for somebody to write a foxtrot. Somebody asked me if anybody knows what a foxtrot is. I said, actually, still is one of those steps that they use in music or dance competitions today. You have to dance the foxtrot. It's kind of a fast-paced music. So he wrote a song, and he actually won the contest. And the song he wrote was called Desert Land. Riviere's deal was, if he published it, that they would publish the song that won, and that whoever published would get a contract that ensured that they would publish 4 pieces of his music within that next year. So now he's in big time. And by the way, the publishing company that he got was the Riviere Publishing Company. They're down in Chicago, so he's Chicago bound now. And that's really where he made his name big time, is in the Chicago area. And he was going to Chicago with a lot of assets with him. He played the organ that they had in all those big theaters down there. He wrote music. So he was now moving up, and he knew a lot of people because he was known by some very well-known people. And when he was down there, by the way, he got a lot of jobs playing in the theaters in the evening because he could play the organ and he could play the piano. And this is a silent movie era here. So I thought I'd throw this up here, the silent movie era. And go through a silent movie. Okay, this doesn't do it to me. I mean, just watching it doesn't do it. So Linda is going to play that song, Desert Land, and you'll see it just sounds like it fits with a silent movie. And he wrote that one, so let me back this up. Are you ready? Doesn't that fit a silent movie perfect? I said, Linda was saying before we started this, she says, so if they're laughing, it's not about my playing? I said, no, it's about this, what they're looking at the screen, and they probably won't be looking at you playing, they'll be watching the screen, but you can get that sense and that genre of the silent movie. I mean, it just was right there. So the first time I heard that song, I said, oh my gosh, I got to find a silent movie to go with that. So thank you, Linda, that was excellent, thank you. So he's now down in Chicago in the Roaring 20s. And if anybody, I'm from the Chicago area, by the way. For those who know, my grandmother who grew up here, she eventually moved as a teenager down to the Chicago area where she raised her family. My mother's back there, by the way. So we all grew up in Chicago. She was born and raised in Chicago, grew up in Chicago. Waupaca, of course, is always, I call her Anchor City. This is where everybody still comes and gathers as a family in Waupaca. So we always kept, you never get rid of your farm. Not in the 20s, you didn't get rid of your farm. So you kept the farm up here in Waupaca. But we grew up in Chicago, right near Wrigley Field. So those of you who know that area on the north side. But Eddie Hanson was there in the Roaring 20s. Now, if you know anything about Chicago in the Roaring 20s, you really didn't want to be in Chicago in the 20s because, well, maybe you did. This is Prohibition era. This is all the gangsters. And Eddie Hanson will tell you he knew them. He will tell you he knew them. During this time, he wrote, he was publishing, as I said, he was guaranteed they would publish 4 songs of his that next year, 1921. I actually looked up what they did for him in 1921. In the U.S. catalog of copyrights, he wrote 46 songs that year. And they published 46 songs, the publishing company. 46 songs they published for him that year. The next year he published over 60 songs. I mean, this was, I can't imagine, it's like one a week. But it seems like if you look at what he was writing, people were writing the words and it came to Eddie Hanson to get the music. So most of those entries in the U.S. catalog of copyright entries are, he's the musician behind the thing. But the Riviere Music Company published tons of music under him. So I guess he got a good deal from 4 guaranteed to this time period there. That 1927 was, I call it, both an evolution and a revolution in the music and entertainment industry because 2 big things happened in 1927. For those of you who are music historians, and by the way, I'm not a historian, but I'm just fascinated by some of these stories. And if I don't have a story to tell, I'll make it up, so you'll never know if it's... But the fact is, in 1927, 2 big things happened. The first talkie movie came out, The Jazz Singer with Al Jolson. If you remember that, or if you've ever heard of that, Al Jolson was a very popular entertainer at the time. And the second thing that happened is the first country hit by Jimmy Rogers, the Blue Yodel #1, came out. That was new. Country music was new, and so was talking movies. And so if you're a musician, by the way, playing in the theaters, your days are done. Your career is done because what do I need you for? They're putting it in the film. So he was a little bit concerned about that, but Eddie Hanson had another trick up his sleeve to accommodate him on that, and that was the radio. So he went over to the radio, and he was the first person over in the radio. WGN, which you know WGN radio, still out there today. He was the first organist at WGN radio. He worked at WCFL radio, still out there, an NBC affiliate. He was the guy on the radio to listen to. You wanted to tune into Eddie Hanson's half hour of organ music as he played his concerts for the people. You also wanted to listen to Eddie Hanson because he was the lead to a lot of those famous movies of the day, including the Amos and Andy Show, the Red Skeleton Show, Fibber McGee and Molly, Rudy Valley. He was the guy in the background playing the music, Eddie Hanson. So he was a regular on the radio down there. I got that article, 1924, March 26, from Nina. Former Nina Boy broadcast program. A number of Nina people listened in last evening on a radio program broadcast by Ethwal Hanson, that's Eddie, from station WDPA at the Drake Hotel. Anybody know the Drake Hotel? Yes, that's a very famous hotel down on Michigan Avenue on the lakefront there. If the Queen ever came to Chicago, which she did a few times, that's where the Queen of England stayed, is the Drake Hotel. It's famous for people going for tea at the Drake Hotel. But he played at the Drake Hotel in Chicago where they broadcast. Mr. Hanson, who formerly was organist at the Doty Theater, is now playing at the Crystal Theater in Chicago. Last evening, his program included 7 numbers of his own composition. So now he's really, I mean, you listen and read the articles about what he's doing. He's made the big time. And he is a big name in Chicago. I also put up there a song he's called At the End of the Sunset Trail. He wrote that, was made popular by Gene Autry, the cowboy musician. Gene Autry sang that regularly on the radio shows he had. That was an Eddie Hanson song that he wrote for that. So he was really now getting in with some big names and making a big... With fame, fortune also came trouble. You know, if you're in the big places, if you're in the theaters, if you're in the entertainment community, and you're also in with the Al Capones and the John Dillingers and all those guys who are hanging out. You know, he actually said that he remembers his mechanic, the mechanic shop where he took his car to. He says he remembers going to work one day and he's driving past the mechanic shop. I was wondering what the heck all the police are out there for. Well, that was the St. Valentine's Day massacre that he witnessed, and it was his mechanic was one of them. He said was killed in there. Picture there, he tells the story of him driving his nice Mercer racer car. He had a big fancy car. The article, if you read the bottom of that thing, it says behind the wheel of the Mercer racer is Babyface Nelson with Eddie Hanson at the right. So hanging out with some pretty interesting people, but it surely adds to the story of this guy's history of who he's hanging with. So he was now doing a lot more in entertainment as far as writing music for dance halls and changing the genre a little bit. He tried to keep up. You know, the silent movies are gone. He's on the radio. He's making his name on the radio. Still writing music. But then came into some of his songs, which I called his dance hall music, his dance hall songs. He started writing polkas and waltzes. And he had polkas and waltzes were popular. Well, a couple here I actually have copies of them up here. Windy City Polka by Windy City, of course, Chicago. Polka that he wrote. There's one over there, the 3-step, called Moon Maid. So he started writing music for that. I actually really, not just because I'm from Chicago, but I really like the Windy City Polka. And I know Waupaca is a polka town, as all of Wisconsin is a polka town. All of Wisconsin is a polka place. So I thought we really need to play one of Eddie Hanson's polkas tonight. So take it away, Linda. Oh, wasn't that fun? Is anybody in the city band? You're in the city band? Okay, you guys got to get this music. I mean, this needs to be played at band concerts in Waupaca. I mean, this is just great pieces. It's from a Waupaca native. It just needs to be part of the collection we have here. So that was a great tune. There's actually words to it. There's actually written 2 sets of words to it. The one that's in the published music sheets is different. When I got the music sheet, and so I mentioned that I was an accordion player. I really wanted to play that on the accordion tonight, but then I heard Linda play. I says, okay, no, she's got it. I practiced enough and said, no, I just got to go to her. But anyway, if you get the written sheet music, it's different words from the recorded music, and so there's really kind of 2 sets of words. Both of them are nice, rather interesting. So, yes. Yes, correct. And notice it says Doty Music Shop. I don't know, does anybody know who Doty is? There's a lot of things over there named Doty. I figure he's got to be somebody in the paper industry, right, part of the paper industry. So a lot of people that he hung out with in Neenah were from the paper industry, wealthy. So he was brought in to play for their various events on that. But yeah, Neenah. So then, I mentioned that now he's getting a little bit older, and in the 50s, Eddie decided to switch the genre one more time. I really think he was just trying to make a buck and stay relevant to the world. But then he started writing country music. And I found it fascinating that some of his music, I mentioned the 1940s was the first, 1927 actually was the first country song, but he started getting the country music. He wrote 2 songs that I actually like. One is, If You Don't Want Me, Then Set Me Free. That was made famous by a famous performer of country songs named Texas Ruby. You can find that on YouTube, by the way. Just look that one up on YouTube and you'll hear Texas Ruby singing that. The second one was actually recorded twice. I have the copies of those recordings. The first one by the Jones Sisters in 1949, Just One More Waltz for Old Time's Sake. And then re-recorded in 1982 by Gene Stafford. If you haven't heard of Gene Stafford, it's because you're in the wrong side of the world, but Gene Stafford was probably the Dolly Parton of Australia. Very famous country singer down in Australia, won many awards for her work down there, but she re-recorded it. It's a beautiful album, and she put it on. So I thought we need to play one of his country songs. Now, I told Linda, we just can't play a country song. You just can't play a country song because you just don't get that country unless you got a singer. So, Marcy?
Linda, Linda's great, isn't she?
Oh my God, that was great, wasn't it? It just had to be sung. I mean, it just needed that southern country style to it. But it just amazes me when the more and more I looked into what this guy did and how he adapted and the different types of music he wrote. Somebody once asked me when I was talking about him. So I typically walk up and down Waupaca every once in a while and say, "Do you ever hear of Eddie Hanson?" And I would say most people say no. But I say, well, he was a famous musician from Waupaca. And they say, well, what kind of music did he write? I said, yes. Name one. He did the style. He just spans such a broad sense. It's almost like the whole 20th century history of music is within his span. So he's just, again, a fascinating person. He went on and he actually, so I point out here, he recorded more of his music was recorded than all the stars you know today. So you'll find his records out there, and you may find them in your closet, and you may find them hidden away, and people have been bringing them to me even today. I got a couple of new pieces that I hadn't seen recorded before. I got them. I'm trying to collect them, and I want to put them in the Historical Society here in Waupaca. But an interesting thing is he was getting older. Eddie Hanson kind of felt like he was, I'm talking 70s and 80s, he was kind of feeling like I'm just not fitting in anymore. He played the organ, not really a popular instrument in the 70s and 80s, but he played the organ and he played a style of music that wasn't very interesting. But he did get dragged back into recording. You can see some of these later ones here. A friend of his over at Rollo Records over in the valley over there talked him into coming back in and doing some more recordings. And some of those are up here. And you're going to see these pieces here. Somebody brought these in today. By the way, it's interesting. I had a couple people come in today as I was kind of getting ready for this thing. I was actually over in the gardens talking to people who are getting the gardens ready. By the way, garden walk this weekend, Saturday, come on by because they're really doing a nice job with there. But people came by and talked to me about the fact that they knew Eddie Hanson. One of the people who worked at Simpson, as he told me, he was a saloon keeper, which means bartender, with Eddie Hanson, and I think his wife is here. Right here? Right here. Yeah, so her husband came by early today. He worked with Eddie Hanson down there, so he knew him well. Another guy came by and I said, I don't know if he's here tonight, said he knew Eddie Hanson. He said, I used to go out drinking with Eddie Hanson and playing pool. So people know he liked to play pool, and they talk about him. He lived on Main Street over the second floor, in an apartment on the second floor. But one of the things in these yellow sheets here, which is where they put his 45s, kind of, I thought, summed up. It kind of sums up in this little piece, so I'm going to read it to you because it kind of sums up what I felt. And it says, yeah, that's kind of what I thought when I listened to Eddie Hanson, too, back in the 70s. This guy was written by the guy who was the president of one of the recording studios. He said, the first time Eddie Hanson came to Target Recording Studios was to look over the facilities prior to cutting his first album for me. Eddie Hanson, Master Organist. I think that's up here. Eddie Hanson, Master Organist. Target specializes in rock and roll and country and western recordings, and numerous long-haired musicians were sitting in the reception room when Eddie walked in. To say that Eddie felt out of place would be a gross understatement. As Al Rollo, president of Rollo Recordings, later told me, he had to plead with Eddie to get him back in the studio for recording sessions the next day. But as Eddie soon found out, he needn't have any misgivings. Any generation gap caused by the differences of age, was bridged by the respect these young musicians had for Eddie's reputation as an organist. The next day, during Eddie's recording session, we had to keep the studio door locked just to keep the crowds from filling the room with spectators. These rock and roll musicians wanted to see the old pro in action. Eddie soon realized that even though these long hairs played rock and roll, they respected great talent, whether it was their brand or not. Now Eddie walks into the studio. He walks with pride as a master who is revered by young and old and his followers, and that's just the way it should be. And so I kind of remember, I really didn't think his music, I didn't get the music, but you had to be fascinated watching him play. And so I pointed out that, that kind of brings me back to where I started with Eddie Hanson. Back at Simpson's restaurant, the beret and his organ he played down there. He returned to Waupaca in his later years, pretty much broken, exhausted of his high life down in Chicago. And he ended his career and he ended his musical life right here in Waupaca. He always said, Waupaca's home. This is his home. He lived in a second-floor apartment on Main Street, just a couple doors down from Simpson's restaurant. And he performed on weekends in Simpson restaurants. And for those of you who knew him, that's maybe where you knew him from. So what is his legacy? I think he has a tremendous legacy, and I really am glad I had the opportunity to kind of bring this back out because I really want to make more of his music, especially in this town here. He lived until 1984 out at King. So in 1984 he went to King, and he lived there for a couple years until he died in 1986. He died on February 22nd, 1986, at either the age of 82 or 87, whichever year he was born. And he's buried in Lakeside Cemetery, where his gravestone says 93, next to his parents. He was married. Eddie will say he was married 3 times, and he always said he's waiting for his 3rd wife to die because she's going to leave him lots of money. I don't know if he ever got that, but he had no children. So I kind of don't want his name to kind of disappear. But what is his legacy? Well, his legacy is obviously in his music. He also has much of his stuff in recordings here. He was one of the guys who would key in the music onto the piano rolls. So you're going to find piano rolls out there that say played by Eddie Hanson out there, and they're really kind of nice pieces. One of his piano, not one of his piano rolls, but one piano roll with one of his songs on it, I actually gave to Mike over at the train depot and see if it plays one of his songs. Actually, the song you heard, Rattlesnake Rag, was actually featured in the Warren Beatty movie Red. So if you ever see the movie Red with Warren Beatty in it, that was performed in that. His legacy is really in Wisconsin, all over in Waupaca in particular. So I kind of like that picture there, the old Eddie Hanson and the young Eddie Hanson, because that's the way I think most of us could think of Eddie Hanson in his last years. But there's one other legacy that I thought we'd kind of close with, and that is one other song that Eddie Hanson wrote. And it's called the Wisconsin Waltz. So the Wisconsin Waltz was written by Eddie Hanson, and it actually, the state legislature in Wisconsin had declared it the state waltz of Wisconsin. So this is the official state waltz of Wisconsin. It was written by Eddie Hanson of Waupaca. And so I'm going to ask Marcy to come back up one more time. And Marcy's going to sing it for us, but I think this song is Waupaca. So I want you all to learn the song. And I think this song should be played at every band concert, every wedding, every event in Waupaca. So you got to get to know this song. So you're all getting copies of the words for the song. Marcy's going to lead you through it, and we're going to learn the Wisconsin Waltz.
All right, so Tracy is bringing out the words, everybody. We're going to learn this together. How many people want to sing tonight? Oh my goodness. It's kind of hard to learn a song like this off the cuff. Some of you maybe can read music. There's a melody line there. So I think what we'll do is play it through once, and then we'll do it again. And you can kind of fall into it however you want. What do you think? Yeah, I'm going to sing it first, I think. We weren't sure how we were going to do this sing along. We don't have a bouncing ball for you to follow along, Mike, that would have been a nice touch. Wait a minute, he said, he's getting something out. Yeah. What are you getting? He's got a pointer or something. Oh. Okay.
You know, I was on Strawberry Fest last year or the year before, and I went to the WDOX table, and I said, have you ever heard of Eddie Hanson, which is my standard question on Main Street now, and he said, no. I said, well, he was actually a famous musician from Waupaca back in the early 1900s. He goes, interesting. I said, well, WDUX plays country music. He wrote some country music songs. He goes, did he? I gave him my card, and I said, give me a call, and I'll get you some information on it if you're interested, and I never got a call back. But no, this stuff should be played on WDUX. It really should. You know, there's a couple other pieces I put up here about his Wisconsin song. I haven't found these pieces, but I think they're down in Madison, so we got to get copies from Madison. The Chain of Lakes Waltz and Wisconsin Wonderland, which others he wrote in the 50s. So, I think, you know, historic melodies from Main Street. Folks, this is your town. This is our town. This is our music. It's just a great collection, a great man. Remember his work and his music, and that's it for tonight. So thank you for coming. For our performers, for our wonderful performers. Excellent work, excellent work. Thank you.